Sterling Dynamics was losing nearly $2 million every single hour. And nobody inside the building could explain why. The automated production line that powered the company's most advanced artificial intelligence robotics division had gone completely silent 3 days earlier, freezing in place like a machine that had simply given up on itself. 50 of the most celebrated engineers in the world had been flown in from the United States, Germany, Japan, and South Korea, each one carrying credentials long enough to fill a wall, and not a single one of them could find the source of the failure. When a man in a worn work jacket finally walked through the front doors carrying an old, scratched toolbox, the chief executive barely looked at him before telling him coldly not to waste her time and simply fix it. The room erupted in quiet laughter. Nobody in that building had any idea that the man they were mocking needed less than a minute staring at the control panel to notice something that 50 brilliant minds had completely missed. 2 hours later, the entire factory was running again. But the truth about who he really was would shake the company far more than the breakdown ever had. The trouble had started on a Monday morning, though nobody could have predicted how far it would spiral. Sterling Dynamics stood on the edge of signing a defense contract worth $12 billion, a deal that would cement the company as the most powerful name in automated manufacturing for a generation. Every department had spent months preparing for the final inspection, polishing every process until it gleamed, rehearsing every answer the government auditors might ask. Then, without warning, the primary production line responsible for assembling the company's flagship artificial intelligence units simply stopped. No alarms triggered a clear diagnosis. No error message pointed to an obvious culprit. The machine simply froze, mid-motion, as though something deep inside the system had lost faith in its own instructions. Victoria Sterling, the chief executive, arrived within the hour, her heels striking the polished floor with the kind of urgency that made junior staff scatter out of her path. She was 37 years old, sharp-featured, always composed, and famous throughout the industry for believing that money could fix anything given enough of it thrown at the right problem. She had built her reputation on decisiveness, on never allowing hesitation to slow her down, and she expected the same relentless certainty from everyone who worked for her. When she saw the frozen line of robotic arms standing motionless under the fluorescent lights, she did not panic. She simply picked up her phone and started making calls, certain that enough expertise, purchased at any price, would solve the problem before the afternoon was over. By nightfall, the first wave of specialists had already arrived, trailing suitcases full of diagnostic equipment and international reputations. By the following morning, that number had grown considerably, until nearly 50 engineers filled the control room, murmuring in different languages, running simulation after simulation, tearing apart code that had taken years to build. Marcus Kane, the company's technical director, coordinated the effort with visible strain etched into his face, aware that every hour of silence from that production line was another hour bleeding money the company could not easily replace. He had worked with Victoria for nearly a decade, and had never seen her this quiet, which worried him more than her usual sharp temper ever could. 2 full days passed without a single breakthrough. The specialists debated theories, argued over conflicting readings, and blamed everything from corrupted firmware to a possible sabotage attempt from a rival corporation. Victoria sat through hours of technical briefings that led nowhere, her patience thinning with every failed explanation. She had spent a fortune assembling what should have been the finest engineering team money could buy, and yet the machines remained as still and silent as they had been on the very first morning. By the third day, whispers had begun circulating that the defense contract itself might be in jeopardy if the line could not be restored before the scheduled inspection. Suppliers were already asking pointed questions about delayed shipments, and board members had begun calling at odd hours, their voices carrying a tension Victoria rarely heard from people who normally trusted her instincts without question. She found herself pacing the length of her office late into the night, staring at spreadsheets that told her nothing, except how much money continued disappearing with every silent hour the line remained frozen. She had built her entire identity around being the person who solved problems other people gave up on, and for the first time in years, she felt the uncomfortable sensation of a problem refusing to bend to her will no matter how much money or authority she threw at it. Inside the control room, the atmosphere had shifted from confident collaboration into something closer to quiet dread. Engineers who had arrived days earlier with bold theories now spoke in careful, hedged sentences, unwilling to stake their reputations on another failed hypothesis. Some had begun quietly checking flights home, privately admitting to colleagues that they no longer believed the fault could be found using conventional diagnostic methods. Marcus watched the morale of his team erode hour by hour, and though he tried to project calm for Victoria's sake, he privately worried the company had reached the edge of a problem with no visible solution. It was Marcus who finally suggested something that made Victoria pause. He mentioned a contractor he had crossed paths with years earlier, a quiet man known in certain circles for solving mechanical failures that everyone else had already declared unsolvable. He explained that this particular engineer worked alone, rarely advertised his services, and took only the jobs that genuinely interested him. Victoria's first reaction was something close to disbelief. She asked, with unmistakable scorn in her voice, how a single, ordinary repairman could possibly succeed where 50 of the best specialists in the world had already failed. Marcus had no perfect answer for her, only a quiet insistence that the man was worth calling, if only because there was nothing left to lose. Reluctantly, Victoria agreed, mostly because the alternative was watching the company hemorrhage money for another indefinite stretch of time. Marcus made the call that afternoon, and within a few hours, word came back that the man would arrive the following morning. Nobody in the control room expected much from the visit. The 50 specialists continued their work through the night, running new simulations, testing new hypotheses, growing more exhausted and more frustrated with every passing hour. By the time morning light spilled through the high factory windows, the mood inside the building had settled into something between despair and quiet resignation, as though everyone had already accepted that the answer might never come. Then the front doors opened, and a man walked in carrying nothing but an old, dented toolbox that looked as though it had survived several decades of honest work. His name was Ethan Brooks, and he did not look like anyone the room expected. His jacket was faded and stained with the ghosts of 100 old repairs. His boots carried streaks of dried oil. He carried no laptop, no tablet, no folder of credentials, nothing that resembled the polished presentation the other specialists had brought with them. Victoria watched him cross the floor with an expression that hovered somewhere between disbelief and irritation, unable to hide the way her eyes traveled from his scuffed boots to his plain, unremarkable face. She had expected someone impressive. Instead, she saw a man who looked like he belonged in a garage, not in a facility preparing to sign one of the largest defense contracts in the company's history. She did not offer a greeting. She did not ask his name, or thank him for coming, or explain the situation with any of the courtesy she might have shown a specialist she respected. Instead, she folded her arms and told him flatly not to waste her time, and to simply fix it. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the room. One of the German engineers leaned toward a colleague and murmured, just loud enough to be overheard, that the man probably did not even understand what kind of system he was looking at. Nobody bothered to hide their amusement. After 3 days of brutal, humiliating failure, the sight of an ordinary repairman being handed an impossible task felt almost like comic relief. A brief moment of levity in an otherwise miserable week. A few of the specialists exchanged glances that suggested pity more than cruelty, the kind of look people give a stranger about to embarrass himself in front of a crowd. Someone near the back muttered that Marcus had wasted everyone's remaining patience by calling in a favor from an old acquaintance instead of trusting the credentials already gathered in the room. Victoria did not correct them. She stood with her arms folded, watching the man in the oil-stained jacket, with an expression that made it clear she expected this visit to end within minutes. One more failed attempt to add to a growing list. Ethan said nothing in response to the laughter. He did not look wounded, or embarrassed, or even mildly bothered. He simply set his toolbox down near the entrance and asked, in a calm and unhurried voice, for 3 things: the electrical schematics of the line, the complete error logs from the past several days, and access to the surveillance footage from inside the machine room. Victoria's patience, already worn thin by 3 days of failure, snapped further at what she assumed was a stalling tactic. She was certain he was buying time. perhaps hoping to disguise his own confusion behind a request for paperwork nobody else had bothered to ask for. Still, she gestured for someone to retrieve the files, if only to prove to herself that this had been a wasted errand. What nobody in that room understood yet was that Ethan was not looking for answers written down on a page. He was looking for a pattern, a shape hidden inside all that scattered information that the 50 specialists, buried in their own individual specialties, had never stepped back far enough to see. He spent the first several minutes simply walking the length of the production line, saying nothing, touching nothing. He moved slowly, his eyes tracing the frozen arms of the machines, the tension cables, the housing panels bolted along the length of the assembly. He paused occasionally to lean close to a joint or a casing, not examining it with any instrument, but simply listening, as though the silence of the machine itself carried information the sensors had failed to record. At one point he knelt beside a support column and inhaled slowly, catching the faint scent of heated metal and old lubricant drifting from somewhere deep inside the structure. Several of the specialists exchanged confused glances, unsure whether they were witnessing genuine expertise or an elaborate performance. He crouched near the base of the largest arm and pressed 2 fingers lightly against a support beam, feeling for the faintest tremor traveling through the metal. He tilted his head slightly, the way someone might when trying to catch a distant sound over the noise of a crowded room. Several specialists had already run vibration analysis using sensitive equipment days earlier. Yet Ethan seemed to be searching for something the instruments themselves had never been calibrated to notice. He moved to the next joint, then the next. Unhurried, methodical, treating the frozen machine less like a broken object and more like a patient whose symptoms had not yet been properly understood. After nearly 20 minutes of silent observation, Ethan asked for something that stunned the entire room. He requested that the whole system be powered down completely. Every subsystem, every backup generator, every redundant circuit that kept portions of the line in standby. A chorus of objections rose immediately. Several specialists warned that a full shutdown could corrupt whatever data remained inside the damaged systems, potentially destroying any chance of recovering the original fault. Marcus, though intrigued by the request, admitted he was nervous about the risk it carried. Victoria's frustration boiled close to the surface, and for a moment, it seemed she might throw the man out of the building entirely rather than gamble the company's already fragile situation on the instincts of a stranger in an oil-stained jacket. Ethan did not raise his voice, and he did not attempt to argue his case with technical jargon designed to impress anyone. He simply told her, plainly, that everyone in the room had spent 3 days treating the symptoms instead of searching for the disease. He said that as long as partial power remained flowing through the system, the true source of the failure would stay hidden beneath a layer of electrical noise that made every reading unreliable. He was not asking her to trust his reputation because he understood he had none in that room. He was asking her to trust that sometimes the only way forward was to stop treating the wound and start looking for what had caused it in the first place. Something in his steadiness cut through Victoria's anger in a way she did not fully understand. Against every instinct honed over years of demanding immediate, visible results, she gave the order to shut the entire system down. The room went dark for a long, uncomfortable stretch of silence, machines settling into stillness, the low hum of electricity fading into nothing. Ethan waited a full quarter of an hour before asking for the system to be brought back online in stages, one subsystem at a time. While he watched each section wake from dormancy, he stood near the central control panel, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, tracking each flicker of movement as though reading a language only he understood. When the third subsystem powered back on, he lifted a hand and asked for it to be paused immediately. He walked directly toward a small module, barely larger than the palm of a hand, tucked into an unremarkable corner of the assembly housing. None of the 50 specialists had ever flagged that particular component during 3 days of investigation. It sat so far from the visible mechanical failure that nobody had considered it worth a second look. Ethan crouched beside it, opened the housing with practiced, careful hands, and studied the internal wiring for a long moment before speaking again. He said, quietly, that this was where the problem had been hiding the entire time. At first, The room reacted with disbelief bordering on mockery. Someone muttered that the man was simply guessing, that no single component that small could possibly account for a failure severe enough to freeze an entire production line worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Victoria stepped closer, arms still folded, waiting for the inevitable embarrassment she assumed was about to unfold in front of everyone watching. Ethan removed the module entirely and held it up to the light, angling it so the tiny internal components caught the glow of the overhead fixtures. He pointed to a single fastening screw, tightened at an angle so slight that it would have been invisible to anyone not specifically searching for it. He explained that the screw had been set at an angle off by only a fraction of a millimeter, a deviation so small it would never have appeared on any standard diagnostic report. Yet that tiny misalignment had introduced a subtle vibration into the module every time the line reached full operating speed. Over the course of many months, that vibration had accumulated, degrading the surrounding circuitry millimeter by millimeter, until the artificial intelligence governing the entire system had detected the instability and locked the whole line down as a last line of defense against catastrophic failure. Marcus stepped closer, squinting at the tiny fastener resting in the center of Ethan's palm, unable to believe something so small could bring an entire production line worth hundreds of millions of dollars to its knees. He asked how anyone could possibly notice a flaw that minor without specialized equipment capable of detecting it. Ethan explained that the equipment had likely detected it days earlier, buried somewhere within thousands of lines of vibration data nobody had time to sort through by hand. The difference, he said, was that he had not been searching for numbers on a screen. He had been searching for the one part of the system that felt slightly wrong beneath his fingertips. A distinction most modern diagnostics were never designed to catch. The room fell into a stunned, disbelieving silence. 50 specialists, who had spent 3 days chasing shadows through thousands of lines of code, stood frozen, staring at a single crooked screw that had been sitting in plain view the entire time. Victoria did not speak. She simply watched as Ethan replaced the faulty component with a fresh one, tightened it with careful precision, and reassembled the housing with the unhurried confidence of a man who had done this exact motion countless times before. He gave the signal to restart the system. The first robotic arm shuddered, hesitated, and then began to move, smooth and steady, exactly as it had been designed to. A second arm followed, then a third. Within a matter of minutes, the entire line was humming back to life, section by section, until the full assembly floor stood in motion once more, exactly as it had before the failure had ever begun. A wave of spontaneous applause broke out among the specialists, some of them laughing in disbelief, others simply standing in stunned silence at what they had just witnessed. Marcus exhaled a breath he felt like he had been holding for 3 straight days. Victoria stood apart from the celebration, watching Ethan quietly pack his tools back into his worn case as though nothing extraordinary had just occurred. She found herself studying him with a very different expression than the one she had worn when he first walked through the door. She stepped closer and asked, with genuine curiosity, replacing her earlier scorn, how he had known where to look when 50 of the finest engineers in the world had missed it entirely. Ethan considered the question for a moment before answering. He told her that machines always tell the truth, even when nobody bothers to listen. He said most people search for problems using instruments and data, forgetting that sometimes the answer reveals itself only through patience, through slowing down long enough to notice what does not fit. Victoria had no immediate response to that. It was not the kind of answer she was used to hearing from the engineers she employed, men and women who spoke in probabilities and technical models. Never in something as simple and unmeasurable as listening. She glanced around at the celebrating specialists, still trading amazed remarks about the misaligned screw, and realized none of them had asked Ethan the question she had just asked. They were satisfied with the result. She found herself wanting to understand the man behind it, a curiosity that felt unfamiliar, and, if she was honest with herself, slightly uncomfortable. Marcus lingered near the assembly line long after most of the specialists had gone home, watching the robotic arms move through their programmed sequences with a kind of quiet fascination he had not felt in years. He had spent nearly 2 decades in the industry, had trained under respected mentors, had built a career on precision and technical mastery, And yet he found himself unsettled by how easily a stranger with no formal credentials had solved a problem his entire department could not. It was not resentment he felt, but something closer to humility. A reminder that expertise sometimes hid in places far removed from diplomas and titles. Later that evening, once the celebration had quieted and the building had begun to empty, Marcus pulled up Ethan's file out of simple professional curiosity. He expected to find an impressive resume buried somewhere beneath the plain exterior, a hidden list of degrees or certifications that explained the man's uncanny instincts. Instead, he found almost nothing. The record listed him only as a repair contractor, with no advanced degrees attached to his name, no notable prior employers, no public record of achievement that would explain what they had all just witnessed. Marcus stared at the empty file for a long time, more unsettled by its blankness than he would have been by an impressive list of credentials. Victoria assumed, at first, that the entire episode had simply been a stroke of unusual luck, the kind of story people would tell for a few weeks before forgetting entirely. But something about the calm certainty in Ethan's voice, and the total absence of any trace of his past, refused to leave her thoughts. That night, unable to shake her curiosity, she began quietly looking into his history herself, running searches through channels available to someone with her resources and her patience. What she found over the following days did not match the man in the oil-stained jacket at all. Buried beneath layers of old records, she discovered that Ethan Brooks had once designed automated manufacturing systems that had been considered groundbreaking in their time, years before Sterling Dynamics had even entered the field. He held a considerable number of patents, several of them foundational to technologies that competing companies still relied upon. He had been offered senior positions at some of the largest corporations in the industry, and had turned every single one of them down. Somewhere in the records, there was a brief, painful mention of a family tragedy, a loss severe enough that it appeared to have driven him away from the ambitious career he had once built, toward a quieter, anonymous life spent traveling from job to job, fixing machines that everyone else had already given up on. One old article, buried several pages deep in her search results, described Ethan as one of the most promising minds of his generation, a man whose early designs had once been studied by graduate students trying to understand the future of automated systems. Another mention, far more recent and far shorter, noted only that he had quietly stepped away from public life, following the loss of his wife, offering no further detail beyond a brief expression of condolence from a former colleague. Victoria read that single paragraph several times, feeling something shift uncomfortably in her chest, an unfamiliar sensation somewhere between guilt and sympathy that she was not entirely sure how to process. She thought back to the way she had looked him over that first morning, the way her eyes had lingered on his scuffed boots and worn jacket, as though they were evidence of something lacking rather than simply the clothing of a man who valued function over appearance. She realized, with growing discomfort, that she had made her judgment in less than 5 seconds, long before he had said a single word, and that judgment had nearly cost her company everything it had spent years building toward. It was not a comfortable thought for a woman who prided herself on precision and control, and it followed her long after she closed the files that night. Victoria read through what little information existed with a growing sense of discomfort. She had mocked this man in front of 50 of her own employees, dismissed him without so much as learning his name, simply because his clothes did not match the expensive suits and polished shoes she associated with brilliance. The realization sat uneasily with her long after she had closed the files, a quiet unease that followed her into the following week. That unease found its way back to the surface sooner than she expected. A major client, one whose approval was essential to finalizing the defense contract, scheduled an unannounced inspection of the facility to confirm that the earlier failure had been fully resolved. The visit was meant to be a formality, a brief tour to reassure a nervous partner that the company remained a safe and reliable investment. Instead, in the middle of the walkthrough, a second system deep within the facility triggered an emergency alert, flashing warnings across every monitor in the control room. Panic returned almost instantly. The same specialists who had celebrated their victory only days earlier now scrambled through diagnostic reports with visible dread, aware that a second failure in front of an important client could unravel everything the company had worked to rebuild. Victoria felt the old instinct to take command rise inside her, the urge to bark orders and demand immediate answers from everyone around her. Instead, she found herself turning toward the quiet man standing near the back of the room, and she asked him, this time with an unmistakable note of respect in her voice, what he thought they should do. Ethan offered a small, calm smile and told her this one would not take nearly as long. He moved through the facility with the same unhurried confidence he had shown before, tracing wires, listening to the subtle hum of machinery, occasionally pausing to explain his reasoning aloud as he worked. This time, several of the 50 specialists gathered around him, pulling out notebooks, taking notes as though attending an impromptu lecture, rather than watching a routine repair. They began to notice something none of them had fully appreciated during the first crisis. Ethan was not simply fixing individual components one at a time. He was tracing the underlying logic that connected every part of the system together, understanding the machine not as a collection of separate pieces, but as a single living structure, each part dependent on the health of the whole. He explained, almost offhandedly, that most failures inside a complex system rarely stayed contained to a single point. A weakness in one section, left unresolved, tended to ripple outward over time, straining neighboring components until the entire structure carried the burden of a single overlooked flaw. He said the 50 specialists in the room were not lacking in skill or knowledge. They had simply been trained to search for problems the way most modern engineers were taught, breaking a system down into smaller and smaller pieces, until the larger pattern connecting everything together disappeared entirely from view. Several specialists lowered their notebooks and simply listened, recognizing in his words a philosophy none of their years of formal education had ever fully articulated. One senior engineer, a professor on sabbatical from a prestigious university, admitted quietly that he had learned more watching Ethan work for 20 minutes than he had absorbed during the entire 3 days of frantic investigation that preceded it. Victoria stood at the edge of the group, watching the man she had once dismissed command the full attention of 50 accomplished specialists without ever raising his voice or asking for it. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something close to genuine admiration for another person, an unfamiliar sensation that unsettled her almost as much as it moved her. Within the hour, the second failure had been resolved, traced back to a smaller but related flaw, stemming from the same root cause Ethan had identified days earlier. The client's visit, which had nearly collapsed into disaster, instead became a demonstration of the company's resilience. And by the time the inspection concluded, the defense contract remained firmly on track. Victoria understood, standing there in the quiet aftermath, that the man in the worn jacket had saved her company twice within the span of a single week, and that she had almost let her own arrogance cost her the chance to see it. The following morning, Victoria called for a company-wide gathering, larger than any meeting the corporation had held in recent memory. Thousands of employees filled the main auditorium, murmuring among themselves, uncertain what announcement could possibly require such scale. Victoria stood at the podium, and for the first time in her career, she allowed herself to appear openly humbled in front of the people she led. She told the room, without hesitation, that she had judged a man based entirely on his appearance, and that her judgment had nearly cost the company everything it had spent years building. She admitted that pride had almost blinded her to the very expertise that ultimately saved them. Then, in front of the entire gathered company, she turned toward Ethan, standing quietly near the side of the stage, and offered him a sincere, public apology. The auditorium fell into complete silence for a long moment. Thousands of faces turned toward the stage, uncertain how to respond to a leader admitting fault so openly in front of an entire company. Then, slowly, a single employee near the back rose to their feet, followed by another and another, until the entire hall stood in a wave of applause that seemed to last far longer than anyone had anticipated. Somewhere in that crowd stood several of the 50 specialists who had laughed at Ethan on his first morning, and more than one of them found themselves clapping with a sincerity that surprised even them. Victoria, still standing at the podium, offered Ethan a formal position within the company, along with a significant ownership stake and a private office matching his newly acknowledged expertise. She meant every word of the offer. hoping it might begin to correct the disrespect he had endured on his first day. Ethan declined all of it, gently but firmly. He told her, in front of everyone watching, that he did not need a title, or an office, or a share of the company's profits. He said all he had ever wanted was to be treated with the same basic respect given to anyone else walking through the door, regardless of what he happened to be wearing that day. He added that titles had a way of changing how people listened to a person, and he had spent years building a life where his ideas were judged purely on their merit rather than on the letters attached to his name. Victoria understood, watching him speak, that he was not rejecting the offer out of modesty, but out of a hard-earned wisdom about what actually mattered. His words landed heavier than any acceptance speech could have. And Victoria found herself nodding slowly, understanding, perhaps for the first time in years, that some forms of value could never be measured in stock options or salary figures. News of the apology traveled through the company faster than any internal memo ever could, whispered between departments that rarely interacted with each other, retold in break rooms and hallways, with a mixture of disbelief and quiet admiration. For many employees, it was the first time they had seen a leader admit fault so completely, without qualification or excuse, and something about that honesty made people trust her in a way they never quite had before. Even those who had never met Ethan personally found themselves speaking of him with a kind of respect usually reserved for people who had spent decades earning it. In the months that followed, the culture inside Sterling Dynamics shifted in ways that outlasted the initial embarrassment of that public apology. Victoria implemented new policies that discouraged employees from dismissing ideas based on rank, appearance, or background, insisting instead that every voice within the company be given a genuine chance to be heard before being judged. Junior technicians began speaking up in meetings where they once would have stayed silent. Contractors and support staff, who had previously felt invisible, found themselves invited into conversations that shaped major decisions. Slowly, without any single dramatic announcement, the company began to feel different from the inside, more honest, more attentive to the people actually doing the work, rather than simply the titles printed on their badges. One maintenance worker, who had spent years quietly noting small inefficiencies in the assembly process without ever feeling comfortable enough to mention them, finally raised his hand during a routine review and proposed an adjustment that ended up reducing equipment strain across an entire section of the factory. A young technician, hired only months earlier and previously too intimidated to speak in front of senior staff, suggested a scheduling change that Marcus later credited with preventing a minor mechanical issue from becoming a much larger one. None of these moments made headlines, but together they reshaped the quiet architecture of how the company functioned, one overlooked voice at a time. Word of what had happened at Sterling Dynamics spread quietly through the industry, carried less by press coverage than by the kind of conversation that travels between engineers who respect quiet competence over flashy self-promotion. Within a year, the company's reputation for innovation and reliability had grown considerably, eventually positioning it as the leading name in automated manufacturing across the entire sector. Analysts pointed to technical improvements and stronger internal processes as the reason for the turnaround, never fully understanding that much of it had started with a single crooked screw and the humility it forced upon the woman running the company. There were mornings when Ethan sat alone in his small rented workshop across town, surrounded by tools and half-finished projects, thinking about the life he had once imagined for himself before everything changed. He had built systems meant to last decades, mentored young engineers who had gone on to shape the very industry that now sought his help, and walked away from all of it when grief made the noise and ambition of corporate life feel unbearable. Fixing machines quietly, without recognition or attachment, had given him something closer to peace than any title ever had. Yet standing in that factory, watching people finally listen rather than assume, he found himself wondering, for the first time in years, whether there might still be room in his life for something more than solitary repair work. Victoria eventually asked Ethan to return, not as an employee bound by contracts or corporate structure, but as an informal strategic advisor who could offer guidance whenever the company faced a problem nobody else could solve. He agreed, on the condition that the arrangement remained simple, without titles or obligations attached to it. Their meetings, when they happened, took place quietly, usually early in the morning before the rest of the building had filled with noise and urgency. On one such morning, months after the chaos of that first week had faded into memory, Victoria found herself preparing 2 cups of coffee instead of one, an unfamiliar gesture for a woman who had spent most of her career commanding others to bring things to her rather than offering anything herself. She carried both cups toward the small conference room where Ethan sat waiting, reviewing a set of blueprints spread across the table. She set one cup in front of him and allowed herself a small, knowing smile as she recalled the first words she had ever spoken to him. The cold instruction not to waste her time. She told him, with quiet honesty, that she remembered exactly what she had said to him that first day, and how ashamed she still felt whenever she thought back on it. Ethan looked up from the blueprints, his expression calm and unbothered as it had always been, and told her that in the end, it seemed they had both learned something worth far more than time. Victoria sat down across from him, and for a while neither of them spoke. The silence between them comfortable in a way it had never been during those first tense days of crisis. Outside the window, the factory hummed steadily along. Robotic arms moving in smooth, practiced rhythm. A machine, finally at peace with itself, after months of hidden instability. Somewhere beneath the surface of that quiet, functioning system lay the memory of a single misaligned screw, a small imperfection large enough to teach an entire company something no consultant or specialist had ever managed to. In the years that followed, people within the industry would occasionally tell the story of the day 50 experts failed, and a quiet contractor in an old jacket walked in and solved what none of them could. Some versions of the story exaggerated the details, turning Ethan into something closer to legend than fact. But those who had actually stood in that room, who had watched him kneel beside a machine and listened to it the way most people listen to another human being, understood the truth was simpler and more powerful than any exaggeration could make it. Genius rarely announces itself with expensive suits or impressive titles. Often, it walks quietly through the front door, carrying nothing but an old toolbox and the patience to notice what everyone else has already stopped looking for. What began as public humiliation slowly transformed into something neither Victoria nor Ethan could have predicted on that first tense morning. A mutual respect built not on flattery or convenience, but on the honest recognition of another person's worth. Their conversations, once limited to schematics and technical failures, gradually widened to include quieter subjects. The kind of small, unhurried exchanges that only happen between two people who have stopped performing for each other and started simply being honest. Victoria found herself looking forward to those early morning meetings in a way she had never anticipated, and Ethan, for the first time since he had walked away from his old life, felt something inside him begin to soften. Whether that respect would eventually grow into something deeper remained an open question neither of them rushed to answer, content instead to let it unfold naturally, the same way Ethan had always approached every machine he had ever repaired, without force, without impatience, simply trusting that the truth would reveal itself in its own time. And perhaps that, more than anything else, was the quiet lesson left behind in the wake of that chaotic week. Real value rarely announces itself loudly. It waits, unassuming, until someone finally slows down enough to notice it standing right in front of them, holding nothing more impressive than an old toolbox and the quiet confidence of someone who has never needed anyone else's approval to know exactly what he is capable of. Long after the story had faded from daily conversation inside the company, a framed photograph remained on a shelf in Marcus's office. A simple picture taken the day the factory came back to life, showing a room full of exhausted, relieved faces gathered around a man who had never once asked to be the center of attention. He kept it there as a quiet reminder, one he revisited whenever a new hire walked through the door looking uncertain of their place, that the most important lessons rarely arrived wearing the clothing anyone expected.